The restaurant shimmered with golden chandeliers, a place where only the wealthy dined without glancing at price tags. In the midst of polished silverware and murmured conversations, a young girl stood at the entrance, her hands trembling. Her clothes, though not tattered, spoke of struggle, an existence far removed from the opulence before her. She took a deep breath, her gaze locked on a man sitting at the corner, sipping an expensive wine. It had to be him. Gathering her courage, she walked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please help me." The words trembled as they left her lips, and in that moment, the entire room seemed to pause.
Hello, I'm the storyteller of the channel, and I would like to ask for a second of your time to subscribe, activate the notification bell, and like the video so that YouTube can take our story to more people who are passionate about stories like this. Thank you, and without further ado, let's continue with our story.
The businessman, mid-sip, lifted his eyes, clearly startled. This was no ordinary interruption. He had built his empire on logic, not sentiment. His first instinct was to dismiss her, to wave her away like a minor inconvenience. But there was something in her eyes, a desperation that cut through the shield of indifference he had crafted over the years. The girl, barely able to hold back her tears, clenched her fists. She knew she had one shot. Real story moments like these didn't come twice. "It's my mother," she pleaded. "She's dying." The weight of her words settled between them, and for the first time in years, the businessman felt something crack inside him. He exhaled sharply, fingers tightening around his glass. Years of hardened decision-making told him to ignore her. The world was full of sob stories, wasn't it? But suddenly, his mind pulled him backward to a memory he had locked away. His sister, the one person who had believed in him when no one else did. He had lost her too young, too soon. He had been powerless then. Was he powerless now? His throat dried as he looked at the girl again. This wasn't just an emotional story. It was fate knocking on his door. A chance to rewrite the past in a different way. The girl's eyes were wide, pleading, waiting for an answer that could change everything. The businessman let out a slow breath, setting his glass down. His mind screamed at him to think logically, but his heart, long buried beneath years of wealth and solitude, was making its presence known. Without another word, he reached for his wallet. But this wasn't just about money. Money alone wouldn't be enough. He stood abruptly, startling the people around him, and extended a hand toward the girl. "Take me to her," he said. The girl gasped, barely believing what she was hearing. As they stepped out, the air was thick with tension. The businessman had never done anything like this before. His driver hesitated when he ordered the car, but one look at his face silenced any objections. The girl directed him through narrow streets, far from the glass towers he was used to. With every passing second, the reality of her life unfolded before him. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to act, but deep down he felt something shift. The city blurred past, yet his mind remained locked on the past, on the choices he had made, and the ones still ahead. The car skidded to a halt in front of a small apartment complex. The girl bolted out, leading him through the dimly lit corridors. A sense of urgency gripped him, adrenaline coursing through his veins. When he finally stepped inside the tiny room, he saw a frail woman gasping for breath on a makeshift bed. The scene was hauntingly familiar, sending shockwaves through him. His mind reeled. He had all the resources in the world, yet none of it had mattered when his sister needed him most. But now, maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference this time. The weight of responsibility crashed over him. He wasn't a doctor, but he could act. "Call an ambulance," he ordered. His voice was steady, authoritative, the voice of a man who got things done. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't closing a deal or expanding his empire. He was saving a life. The girl gripped his arm, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But he wasn't done. Not yet, because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about one moment. It was about what came next. The sirens pierced through the quiet night as the ambulance pulled up. Paramedics rushed in, their movements precise, practiced. The businessman stood frozen, watching them work. The frail woman, barely conscious, was lifted onto the stretcher. The girl clung to her mother's hand, whispering reassurances through her tears. He knew that look, the same one he had worn when his sister was slipping away. That helplessness, that fear, it clawed at him now, just as it had then. But this time, he had the power to change the ending of this real story. He followed them into the ambulance without hesitation, ignoring the odd looks from the paramedics. Sitting across from the girl, he watched her grip her mother's hand like a lifeline. Her entire world was crumbling, and yet she held on, refusing to let go. He had been in her place before. He had prayed, begged, bargained, only to watch helplessly as time ran out. He thought he had buried those feelings beneath his wealth, his empire. But here they were, unearthed, raw, demanding to be felt. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel them. At the hospital, the doctors moved quickly. The businessman watched from the waiting area as the girl sobbed silently, shoulders shaking. His instincts told him to leave. He had done his part. He wasn't a savior, just a man who had been in the right place at the right time. But his feet wouldn't move. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the girl reminded him of his younger self. Maybe it was the ghost of his sister whispering in his ear, telling him to stay. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the moment that would change everything. Hours passed. The girl sat curled in a chair, staring blankly ahead. The businessman paced, unable to sit still. When the doctor finally emerged, her expression was unreadable. The girl shot up, eyes pleading. "She's stable," the doctor said. Relief crashed over them both. The girl broke down in tears, and before he could think, he reached out, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "She's alive," she choked out, as if saying it aloud made it real. He nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. This touching story wasn't over. The girl turned to him, eyes shimmering with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." He shook his head. "Don't. Just take care of her." He expected that to be the end of it. A good deed, a moment of kindness, and then he'd return to his world of contracts and negotiations. But something inside him told him that walking away wasn't an option. Not this time, because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about saving a life. It was about what that life could become. And for the first time, he found himself wondering how much more he could do. The girl hugged him tightly, and for a brief second, he saw his sister in her. The pain of loss clashed with the possibility of redemption. He had spent years chasing success, but what had it really given him? More zeros in his bank account? A name that carried weight in boardrooms? None of it compared to the feeling swelling inside him now. It wasn't about charity. It wasn't about guilt. It was about something greater, something he had ignored for too long. As he watched the girl sit by her mother's bedside, he realized he wasn't done. Not yet. Something had shifted. He didn't just want to help this girl. He wanted to change lives. But how? He wasn't a doctor or a philanthropist. He was just a businessman. Or at least, that's what he had believed. Until now, because for the first time, he saw wealth differently. Not as power, but as opportunity. And suddenly, he wasn't thinking about profits and investments. He was thinking about people, about the lives that could be transformed. The question wasn't if he could help. It was how much he was willing to give. And for the first time, the answer was simple. Everything. The drive back home felt different. The city lights blurred past the car windows, but his mind was elsewhere. He had spent years making deals, expanding his empire, but for the first time, none of it seemed to matter. That hospital room, that desperate girl, her mother fighting for life. Those were real stories that existed beyond his world of wealth. He had always believed success was measured by numbers, but tonight, he had learned something new. Success wasn't about how much you had. It was about what you did with it. And he wasn't done yet. The next morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that had settled in his chest. He arrived at his office, sat at his mahogany desk, and stared at the city skyline. He had built towers, businesses, wealth beyond imagination, but what had he really built? He tapped his fingers against the desk, his mind racing. That girl had been willing to beg a stranger for help. How many others were out there, waiting for someone to notice them? It wasn't just about one life. It was about all the lives that slipped through the cracks. And he had the power to change that. That thought set something in motion. He made a call, then another. Within hours, his team was in his office, watching as he outlined an idea that had nothing to do with profit. A scholarship fund, not just for one girl, but for dozens. Hundreds. Kids who had the drive, but not the means. He had spent his whole life investing in things that grew wealth. Now, he wanted to invest in something that grew people. His team exchanged glances, confused. This wasn't like him, but he didn't care. Find the best candidates, he ordered. We're going to change lives. But it wasn't enough. As the days passed, he realized education was just one piece of the puzzle. What about families struggling for a home? The kind of home that could provide stability, safety, hope? He had built skyscrapers, luxury apartments, commercial hubs. But affordable housing? He had never considered it. Until now. Within weeks, he was sketching plans, buying land, meeting with developers. If he could build wealth, he could build opportunity. And for the first time in his life, his investments weren't just about returns. They were about redemption. Word spread quickly. A wealthy businessman funding education, building homes for those in need. It was unheard of. The media called him a philanthropist, but he brushed off the title. This wasn't about labels. It was about purpose. He spent years thinking his money gave him power, but now he saw it differently. Money wasn't power. Money was a tool. And in the right hands, it could change the world. Every time he saw a family moving into one of his homes, every time a student received a scholarship letter, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, fulfillment. And yet, he found himself thinking about her. The girl who had sparked this entire transformation. How was she? What had become of her mother? He had done all of this because of one moment, one decision to help. But where was she now? He had changed so many lives in the past few years, but he had never gone back to see the first one he had helped. That question lingered in his mind, whispering to him at night, tugging at his thoughts during the day. Had she made it? The answer, he would soon find out, would change everything. Years passed, but that night in the restaurant never left him. He had built scholarships, homes, and opportunities, but one question remained unanswered. What happened to the girl? He had never forgotten her desperate eyes, the way her voice had cracked when she begged for help. So one evening, curiosity led him back to the hospital where it all began. He asked about her mother and learned that she had survived, thanks to the immediate medical attention. And the girl? She had vanished into the world, leaving behind only a name. But names had a way of resurfacing. One morning, flipping through the newspaper, something caught his eye. A headline, a story. Newly licensed doctor shares heartfelt tribute to the man who saved her family. His breath caught. He read every word. It was her, the girl he had once helped, now a doctor, standing proudly in her white coat. She had worked tirelessly to achieve what once seemed impossible. But what stopped his heart was what she had written. I am here today because a stranger chose kindness over indifference. He taught me that one act of generosity can ripple through a lifetime. It was her story, but it was also his. He sat in silence, rereading the article. He had spent years thinking he was the one changing lives, but in reality, kindness had its own way of circling back. A few weeks later, he was invited to an event at a university, a ceremony honoring scholarship recipients. He had attended dozens before, but this time, something felt different. As the guest speaker was announced, he nearly stopped breathing. It was her. She walked onto the stage, her presence confident, her voice steady. He was just another face in the crowd, until she locked eyes with him. She smiled, and then she spoke. Many years ago, a stranger helped me when I had nothing to offer in return. That moment shaped my entire journey. And today, I dedicate my work to that lesson, because the greatest wealth isn't measured in money, but in the lives we touch. The audience applauded, unaware that the man she spoke of was sitting right there, his heart pounding. He had once saved her mother's life, but now, she was saving lives every day. His one act of kindness had become something much greater than he had ever imagined. When the ceremony ended, she walked up to him, her eyes shining. I was hoping you'd come, she said softly. He chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. You found me. She nodded. You found me first. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of years hanging between them. I never got to thank you properly, she said. He waved a hand. You don't have to, but she held his gaze. I do, because you didn't just help me. You changed my entire future. He swallowed hard, realizing the truth in her words. He had once thought of wealth as power, but now he saw it differently. He had spent years building his fortune, but in the end, it was this touching story, this single moment, that had mattered the most. She had taken his kindness and multiplied it, carrying it forward in ways he never could have predicted. And in that moment, he understood true wealth wasn't in bank accounts or boardrooms. It was in the people we lift up. It was in the lives we change. And most of all, it was in the stories that live on long after we're gone. But something told him that this story wasn't over yet. Not even close. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment of the past years. He had spent his entire life believing that success was measured in numbers, assets, and power. Yet, here he was feeling more fulfilled by a single real story than by all the millions he had accumulated. The girl's words echoed in his mind. You changed my future. He had always thought of himself as a businessman, but for the first time, he wondered if his real purpose had been something greater all along. The next morning, he walked through his office with new eyes. The glass walls, the skyline views, the fast-paced meetings, all of it had once symbolized achievement. But now they felt hollow. What was the point of power if it didn't create impact? He had built skyscrapers, but had he built meaning? He had closed deals, but had he opened doors? The answer had never been clearer. He picked up his phone and made a call. I want to restructure my foundation, he said. More scholarships, more housing, but also something bigger, something that will outlive me. Over the next few months, everything changed. He expanded his projects beyond just funding. He created mentorship programs, invested in healthcare initiatives, and partnered with organizations that truly understood what struggling families needed. It wasn't just about giving money. It was about creating a system where people could rise on their own. He sat in meetings, not with CEOs, but with students, single parents, and doctors, people who had been given a chance and were now using it to help others. And for the first time in his career, he felt something that no business deal had ever given him: peace. One afternoon, he found himself back at the hospital where it had all started. He walked through the halls, passing by people who would never recognize him, never know what he had done. And yet, that was the beauty of it. True impact wasn't about recognition. It was about results. As he reached the exit, a young nurse walked past him, carrying a clipboard. She paused, glancing at him with a soft smile. Excuse me, are you him? He chuckled. Depend on who him is. She laughed. The businessman who saved a life here years ago. He nodded. I guess I am. She shook her head in admiration. You should know, you didn't just save one life. That girl? She's a doctor now, and her work is changing so many lives. His chest tightened, emotion pressing against his ribs. He had known it, of course, but hearing it from a stranger made it real in a way he hadn't expected. Thank you for telling me, he said softly. As he stepped outside, the sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the city. The world kept moving, unaware of the moment he was having. But that was okay, because he didn't need the world to notice. He knew, and that was enough. Standing there, he thought about the man he had been before that fateful night at the restaurant. The man who saw wealth as numbers, as status, as control. That man no longer existed. In his place stood someone different, someone who understood that true wealth wasn't about having, but about giving. He had spent his whole life chasing success, but in the end, success had found him. Not in boardrooms, but in hospital hallways, in college graduations, in homes filled with laughter instead of worry. And that, he realized, was the only legacy that mattered. As he walked away, he knew this wasn't the end. There were more lives to touch, more futures to change. And as long as he had the means, he would never stop. Because once you understood the true meaning of wealth, you couldn't unsee it. You could only keep giving, keep building, keep changing the story, one act of kindness at a time.